As we await President Obama's comments, earlier this morning, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest condemned the attack in Paris, but in two different interviews, he called it an act of violence, not terrorism. His tune changing a bit when he talked to our own Bill Hemmer. Listen.
This is an act of terror that we condemn in the strongest possible terms.
Just 30 minutes ago, you called it a terrible act of violence, as you just mentioned there. And now you call it terror. What changed?
This is still something that we're looking into. I know that the French president has called this an act of terror. It does seem to be that's exactly what this is.
Now, shortly before Earnest's appearance on FNC, the president released a statement calling the attack terrorism. And just an hour ago, Secretary of State John Kerry addressed the attack on the paper.
The freedom of expression that it represented is not able to be killed by this kind of act of terror. On the contrary, it will never be eradicated by any act of terror.
Okay, so we've seen this before, Eric, and I really think that if the White House had not handled other instances of radical Islamic terror this way, this wouldn't be such a big deal. But this is their playbook. When it's so obvious it's radical Islamic terror, it's an act of jihad, their knee-jerk response is to just call it an act of violence.
Workplace violence. Fort Hood, Allah Akbar, Nid al-Hassan stood up, blew away 13 or 14 people, depending on how you count. It could be up to 14 people. That was clearly a work by an Islamic terrorist who had ties to an imam here in Virginia. Okay, same thing happens here. They stand up, they yell Allah Akbar, they ask people their names. They're looking for they're looking for the editor, they're looking for the two cartoonists who put up the cartoon of the prophet, blew those people away. I mean, to take an hour or two to call it terror is bad enough, but then still never once did they say Islamic terrorism. And not only did they not say it, John Kerry even quotes an imam. So if you say, look, here we're recognizing there are Muslims, Islamists who are against this terror, you're recognizing that there is a tie to Muslim extremists, right? Is you're using that as part of your speech, but then you won't call it Islamic terrorism when it really is. I don't know what the PC crap they're doing here, who they're trying to not offend, who they're playing with, who they're fooling. They're certainly not fooling the American people. It's time to get tough with Islamic terrorists and really crack down, unless you want more of that to happen, you know, emigrate from Europe to America.
It's like they haven't learned their lesson, Harris. And Ralph Peters was on earlier, military analyst, and he said if you don't define your enemy, if you don't acknowledge your enemy, you're never going to be able to defeat it. And we see this White House, as Eric points out, a PC response yet again, even quoting an imam. I mean, really? You're not going to call it Islamic terror, but you'll cite the words of an imam?
But look who the witnesses are in all of this. I mean, these are journalists who are witnessing this. And yes, they're being terrorized, but some of these people are taking the different kinds of notes on what's happening. They're listening. The terrorists are telling them who they are. That you may not be able to see their faces, and that was my question to Kitty. You can imagine that they're equivalent to the CIA and the FBI inside that country, France, right now. They're trying to figure out, based on what the witnesses were told, they communicated exactly who we are. We want you to know we're leaving our mark.
Kennedy, I want to bring up the White House's comments on free speech. Josh Earnest, when he talked to Bill Hemmer as well, he talked about this as an attack on basic human rights, like free speech. This is not exactly an administration that has protected free speech when it comes to certain people, like the filmmaker of the Benghazi video.
That's exactly right. And, you know, Francois Hollande, I mean, he's a socialist, and he's wildly unpopular in France, but he is a president who has stood up for free speech in his country back in 2006, when Charlie Hebdo was first in the news for some of these cartoons. And, you know, we should be talking about free speech. We should be talking about the brave people, the cartoonists, the editor, Sharb, who lost his life today, who's brutally murdered by Islamic terrorists. And here's a guy who said, I prefer to die standing up than live on my knees. You know, it's kind of a shift on a Euripides quote. He said that in Le Mans 2 years ago. What an incredibly brave thing. After they were firebombed in 2011, they still kept going. And a lot of people on Twitter are using the hashtag Je suis Charlie, which is French for I am Charlie. And it's like, you're not. They were the brave ones. They were really the only ones who were doing this. And, you know, a lot of people have shied away from this sort of expression. And it's the kind of free speech that we were talking about yesterday that has to be protected.
So, Shannon, I wanted to read this quote. In 2012, President Obama, after the attacks on Benghazi, said this: "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam." It's similar to the White House's response to the Ferguson attacks, right? Wave your hand at the police, but not the wrongdoers. This is not a White House that has embraced free speech. I mean, they've targeted our own James Rosen. So to see Josh Earnest step up today and say, we believe in free speech, bit disingenuous.
Well, and that quote, I think, from the president was given at the UN. So he was speaking out to the entire world saying, you know, it can't be about the people who would challenge these stereotypes, who would make up these cartoons and do those kinds of things. And there is a lot of criticism coming at the administration from the Hill already today. People, first of all, acknowledging this is tragic. We are with the people of Paris and all of those who lost their lives, the ones who were standing boldly for free speech and journalism, and also the police who were there to try to assist. But at the same time, we have Senators Graham and Ayotte, both Republicans, coming out saying there are multiple problems here. First of all, we have a very open visa process with France, so don't think this can't show up here very quickly and very easily. And also, Senator Graham specifically going after the president for issues on detention and interrogation, saying that is why we have to have those policies in place, because this was very organized. I think we'd all acknowledge, even with what little we know now, this wasn't lone wolf. One witness said they had a rocket launcher. These guys, as you watch the video, were very organized. They were very calm. They stopped to pick something up in the street as they were leaving.
And eyewitnesses said they were speaking unaccented French, which means they were French citizens. They you know, are, you know, logically you would think that they also have French passports, and you know,
and not just speaking to each other.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing. They want to leave a message. They are communicating it. You know, it's interesting. On Charlie Hebdo's Twitter page today, about an hour before the shootings, there was a satirical cartoon of Islamic State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who we know leads ISIS. So, you know, I mean, it's interesting. That is the kind of free speech, you're absolutely right, that we have to protect.
Can we just point out something else, too? The Muslim population in France right now, 5 million people, 8% of the population, 2 million people in America. The point is they have a very open, arms wide open, come with us, you're welcome here. Problem is, once this population grew, there are 12 different cities within Britain that were Muslims that said, we want to be self-ruled. We want to rule by Sharia law within these areas. They're called no-go zones. And the police literally back off and let them rule themselves and let them police themselves. That breeds this type of extremism when these people have the ability to say, you know what, we're not going to abide by national law or local law. We're going to abide by our own law. And then they have this extremist faction that grows within. Of course they're going to speak French. Of course they're going to be Muslim extremists who speak French. They come from within the community.
It's not just that they're speaking French, they're speaking unaccented French. And you can tell the difference, obviously, you know, if you encountered some people who were shouting they were from another country and whose native language was different, you would hear the difference in their speech.
Yeah, I know we're going to come back to this a little bit later because there's news that's breaking on this that we're anticipating that's going to happen even later this hour. But I don't want to miss an opportunity. You lived in Paris.
I did.
And you know, because of the ages of the people who have been radicalized, you witnessed some of this indoctrination happening.
That's right. I lived in an area that was on a cusp of a neighborhood that was highly Muslim. I speak fluent French. I wrote my dissertation when I lived there on the rise of radical Islam in Paris and basically predicted this. Now, my liberal professors at the time didn't like the topic of my paper, but I only decided to switch my topic when I was attacked with a friend in Nice by a group of radical Muslims.
And by the grace of God, got away from that.
I did. I got away from it, but it was a huge problem, and you could tell at the time it was starting to bubble up. The immigration of, you know, French colonies in the 1960s to countries like France and Germany and England, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, former French colonies, they would migrate, and it's not the older generation, it's the younger generation that you saw very angry, starting to rise up to become radicalized. Then you saw the riots in the banlieue, in the neighborhoods surrounding Paris, shortly after, a couple years, 2003, I believe. So this is not a surprise. I think Nicolas Sarkozy saw this coming, banning the headscarves. It was very controversial, the Muslim garb. But France knows that it has a problem with this. What I think is so telling, and I know we got to go, but this is unique because this is the first time that a military assault of this kind has happened on a soft target. We've seen these lone wolf attacks, but this is a military style. These guys were trained on a very soft target, and the question becomes, and we're going to address this later in the show, could it come here? And it's why the debate right now in New York and the relationship between the mayor and the police and our mentality that this country is taking from the administration, an anti-cop mentality, is so wrong at this time.
Well, and have we already potentially seen it come here? I mean, we have the trial beginning with jury selection this week of one of the Tsarnaev brothers. And when you look at the radicalization and the growth within a country that you're describing was happening inside France, particularly Paris, we're seeing some of that in the Caucasus. Right? I mean, we're seeing that among, you know, in Russia and among some of those, what I call the stand countries.
Meanwhile,
you know, the Kazakhstans and the...
And there was free travel by the Tsarnaev brothers, you know, back and forth in and out of the U.S. And that's something that raises a lot of other concerns.
Well, also, I mean, after the Boston Marathon bombing, you know, the administration through intermediaries was trying to pin it on white Tea Party activists. You know, they were trying to tie the Boston Marathon bombing to Patriots Day, and it's like...
But
that's just sad.
The hesitation,
and I get chills when you say that because I get angry, and I'm like, where am I going to take that anger? Because that's just ridiculous.
And if you're anywhere near New York, you should feel the same anger, if not more so, because you have a mayor who's pointing the finger at cops, saying, "Look, cops shouldn't profile African American men. They shouldn't do it." Well, should cops profile Muslims? Should cops profile Muslims within a range that, frankly, have been responsible for most of the terror attacks in this country and abroad? I would go on a limb and say, yes, you have to give cops, law enforcement, that tool that they've used so effectively for so long to be able to say, this is the type of person who's done it in the past, not saying he did it or will do it, but, you know, we're going to keep an eye on them. We're going to keep it. Remember this whole issue with the NYPD listening in on some mosques here in the city?
Right.
And there was huge pushback. Meanwhile, some of them were tied to some extremist events. I think this is bad. I think Mayor de Blasio pointing the finger at cops, taking tools out of their hands for whatever, for whomever they want to stop and frisk, listen into. It's very, very dangerous in light of what's going on around the world.
I mean, there's plenty of listening. There's no shortage of data collection and wiretapping and cloud collection and text collection and everything else. The problem is there's so much of it, you can't target the people who absolutely need to be targeted. When you're collecting data on everyone, you can't focus on the people who are the most problematic.
Well, and just you mentioned de Blasio, but just weeks ago, the Attorney General, who's over the top law enforcement officer of the entire country, said we're going to stop profiling. In a lot of these cases, most of those cases, that is going to be taken out of the equation. He just said it maybe 2 weeks ago.
Right. And
criminals are profiling our
cops. That's what they're having to do right now. We don't know what these guys are planning, right? They're still looking for these 3 guys, and could be more. We don't know within France right now. So they've got to profile in some way to figure out, well, which suburb are they going to?
Harris, how did profile become a bad word? How did profile become A, unethical, B, illegal? It's throughout history been the most effective law enforcement tool.
I mean, I guess if I were a law-abiding person of color, who was
if you're a law-abiding person,
you can look in my direction.
I think you are.
Okay.
I think I would be pretty upset if I were walking down the street minding my own business and cops were pulling me over.
As a law-abiding person of color on the couch,
there's no.
We happen to have one.
Yeah.
I will tell you that, you know, there are 2 ways of looking at it. I'm not doing anything wrong. I know I'm going to be asked questions. It's how you ask the question. Yeah. So can we have a conversation about what stop and frisk or what the motive, the way that we're going to carry it out is going to look like? That's what we need to talk about. Not whether or not we're going to have it, because profiling is necessary.
So let me ask you this.
Right?
You go
so
to
just
the
talk to me as a human, and I'll give you what I got.
We walk down the street.
Whether we unintentionally.
Yeah, but the certain type of profiling that Eric mentioned was highly effective because it was targeting mosques. And if you listen to Congressman Peter King, he said that information was highly valuable. And I know that we, only cover the crashes, not the successful takeoffs of airplanes. Same thing in New York. There have been a number of terror cells that have been busted up. They get little stories here and there, but we only hear about the big attacks that are successful or the ones that we catch trying to, blow themselves up in Times Square. But that surveillance in the mosques, I think it's crucial, and it's leftist mayors like de Blasio and the administration, progressives, that have taken those tools away at a time when we need them the most.
I'm a big fan of the Fourth Amendment, though, too. So you got to find that balance.
Get a warrant. If there's a mosque and you've got people in there and you know they're doing bad things, get a warrant.
Search and seizure.
All right. Well, we'll continue to bring you the very latest on the deadly terror attack in Paris as we await new comments from the president, and the manhunt continues for those masked terrorists.
Hi, I'm William Devane. And look at this, $18 trillion in debt. And by tomorrow, it will have risen another 500 million. Now, if that doesn't concern you, it should. How do you get more control over your investments and retirement with debt like this racking up against you? Buy gold and silver from